were stabled, all excellent, all derelict at the point at which we took ownership, and have been sort of lovingly restored, from butcheries to meeting rooms to what I've got to say is quite a special amphitheatre, walled garden, which is terraced, looks out over the Bristol Channel, and we think, although we haven't tested it, can sit 1,000 people. Like I say, not a sales pitch. And the reason we did that was to create opportunities to reconnect. So from cooking with fire experiences to butchery to yoga and mindfulness and foraging and seasonal cookery, to supper clubs and events, restaurant nights, woodland feasts, all of which in the spaces that we've lovingly sort of restored, but basically trying to deliver on that mission of reconnection. We're trying to feed you the landscape and connect you with the things that we're so passionate about. And we've been kind of feeling our way towards a business model to make this viable. And the business model that we've come up with is corporate partnerships. We've ended up with we would call it a business ecosystem probably, and we've ended up there either through inspired accidental wanderings, or perhaps something even more profound than that. But we've ended up with something which I think is fairly powerful. So a series of corporate partnerships from businesses who basically want to use our facilities for the meetings and the conferences and the networking and the team building and that sort of thing, which you can understand in a really conventional sense. It's been made even more powerful by the recent crisis, and how teams are now disparate and far away, and people are, or businesses are, questioning whether they even need an office, and if they don't need an office, then how do they gather from time to time? So from the literal use of our spaces and facilities, we take money from corporate partners, or at least that's the plan. So that's what we provide. What we deliver, or what those partnerships deliver, is financial support for our rewilding and rewetting project, and the financial or commercial security for our education and inspiration program. So in a nutshell, I go to a business and I say, whilst everything that we've got is wonderful, the sum of the parts that I'm trying to sell you is X, but I want to charge you double that. And here's why I think you should pay double. I think you should pay double because I'm going to take all of the spare money and I'm going to rewild and restore biodiversity. I'm going to use it to sequester carbon. I'm going to use it to bring children into nature. And the more corporate partnerships I can get, the more of that I can do. And so in essence, I think that no one piece of our jigsaw can exist without the other, which is why I sort of slightly grandly referred to it as a business ecosystem, because I don't think that the corporates come and choose us without those green pillars. And I don't think the green pillars exist without the funding from the corporates, and the education is completely wed to the green piece. So all intrinsically linked, and one feeding the other. And like I say, we arrived there by accident, but I'm quite proud of it. I think we've ended up with something quite compelling. So the corporates, we've talked about environment, we've talked about the place, and we've talked about the facilities, and we talked about the business model. And I was just touching on the green pillars of environment, education, and community. So that is the piece of the jigsaw or one of the pieces of the jigsaw that facilitates that commercial activity and is facilitated by the commercial activity. And that's the bit that I'm going to unpack a little bit more today. So, like I say, the conversation could go in lots of different directions, because the rewilding is based on a project just across the road at a site called Waterways Farm. It's very deliberately based there because the Belmont Estate, the formal Belmont Estate, is grade 2-star listed. That's the landscape and the buildings. And whilst that's a wonderful thing in terms of preservation, preservation is tricky when you try and apply something as open-ended as rewilding. And quite often the enemy of rewilding projects is designations like SSSIs, and well, one of the enemies, because our systems for so long have been about predictable, compartmentable, that's not a word, boxes that we can put things in, and rewilding doesn't want to fit in that box. So if we were going to do it at all, we had to do it at a place that wasn't listed. So the place we chose was Waterways Farm, which I'll talk about in a minute. Rewilding is dynamic. It's deliberately dynamic and uncontrollably dynamic. It's the whole purpose of it is that you try not to predict. It doesn't stay the same, and you try and remove, someone like me especially tries to remove the arrogance of your own management from it. It's diverse. It's amazing how often the answer to the question, whatever that question might be, is diversity. I've noticed this as I give talks and walks, and as I re-strategize about our land management. The answer is so very often diversity. Rewilding in itself is about letting nature create that patchwork, mosaic, diverse landscape which no longer exists. But on a bigger, broader sense, rewilding isn't the only answer. Going down to the bottom of this list, it's a critical piece of the jigsaw. What is required is diversity. We need a range of different land management techniques, with rewilding critical amongst them. It's a motive. It means different things to different people. To some people, it means that we're going to put bears back over at Waterways, just on the outskirts of Nailsea, which we're not. To other people, it means it's sometimes not mowing your garden. It is all of those things, and it's none of those things, and it's very, very emotive and different in everyone's heads. The differences or the challenges of that different interpretation shouldn't stop us from engaging in the principles of rewilding. It's so very, it will be so very powerful in our fight against the dual crisis of climate change and biodiversity decline, that we mustn't let those interpretations and differences between interpretations stop us. It's also challenging. So I'm a farmer or a land manager and or a conservationist. I've been all of those things in my career. I've never done anything else. And frankly, I've spent my life doing the opposite to that which rewilding does. So I've spent my life, even though I've worked in conservation, I've worked for the National Trust, and I've always, if I've managed estates and farms, been managing extensive nature-focused places. Rewilding throws up things which just challenge me. So seeing a field full of docks and thistles is challenging. No, I'm bought into it. It's even more challenging for the owners that I've dragged into this particular strategy. And it's challenging for their neighbours, and it's challenging for us all to see things which we've spent a lifetime presuming are incorrect. The example I often use here is if you, and it will touch on this as an example, touches on a few of the other things that I've listed before. But if you imagine you're walking through a beautiful U-shaped valley in the Lake District, and there are heap, and the grass is just that short, it's like a snooker table, and it's U-shaped, and your heart sings because you feel like you're in nature, and you feel like everything is right with the world. And then actually to challenge that, now try and remember if you saw any wildlife. It doesn't have any diversity. It's not a dynamic landscape. It's completely fixed and overgrazed. And other than the Herdwick sheep and the crows, because crows seem to be able to thrive in any scenario that we can throw at them, what did you see? You won't have seen very much at all. You could equally have you could equally apply that criteria to Scotland. So if you go to Scotland, some of these utterly beautiful, dramatic, stunning vistas, other than red deer and again crows, what wildlife do you see? You see really none. Again, it's a lack of dynamism and a lack of diversity. But it's a challenge to that which we've felt for our whole lives, which is a feeling of contentment in what we consider to be the truest manifestation of the countryside. And to realize that it's broken and it's dysfunctional and it's actually damaging is a bit challenging at times. To keep pushing this model, if you're in the center of a farmer's field, you also may or may not feel like that's wonderful, but I would challenge you to remember seeing much wildlife in the center of a farmer's field and to keep pushing it. Imagine now that you're in the middle of a woodland, and can you actually remember seeing any wildlife? standing in the middle of a woodland. Now, we really feel deep in our hearts that woodlands are perfect, but they're not dynamic nowadays, and they're not diverse. Then nowadays, certainly in the local area, they are very often all the same age, and the result is that there isn't diversity in there, and that you really don't see any wildlife. They're not functioning as an ecosystem. So all the way along, rewilding is challenging, but as luck would have it, it's also hopeful. So it's a story of what we can do, not what we can't do. I don't know if anyone has read Isabella Tree's book, Wilding. If ever there was a book of hope, then that's one. There are some other excellent books which I could recommend, but if I was only going to recommend one, it would be Rewilding by Donald, which is not really about birds at all. It uses birds to tell the story of rewilding, and I think it might just pip Isabella Tree's book, but both wonderful. And rewilding is genuinely and truly productive. So we have to feed the world. That's granted. We're back to our diverse jigsaw of different land management options, but rewilding can be productive on a number of levels. So it's productive in terms of biodiversity. It's productive in terms of it still can produce protein to eat, and our project does, and most projects do, because at the heart of rewilding are herbivores. It's productive in terms of connection, and productive in terms of ecosystem services, which we'll talk a bit about later, but ecosystem services ranging from carbon sequestration to managing the crazy amounts of rainfall that we get at the moment. It doesn't seem to ever drizzle anymore. It only ever biblically thunders down, and so we need a landscape that can cope with that. And I've already touched on the fact that it's a critical piece of the jigsaw, but the key part of that sentence is that it's a jigsaw. If we just rewild the whole world, as brilliant as it would be for wildlife, we will come a cropper in terms of the amount of protein we need to eat one way or another. So we could talk about this for a long time, but in a literal sense, what is rewilding? So I'll rattle off this slightly obtuse definitions down the bottom. If you were to go onto the internet and just Google what is rewilding, you'd find 100 different definitions, but ultimately it is the restoration of natural processes. It's amazing how few natural processes remain, either completely or unmanaged by our own land management. Examples that I would give, which is specific to watercress, is our land's not allowed to flood anymore, our rivers are not allowed to move anymore, trees are not allowed to fall over, die, rot anymore. It just goes on and on and on. Natural processes do not fit with the sort of linear and structured way that we like to lead our lives. It's the recreation of complex and functioning ecosystems. So what we have in a farmland at the moment is a really, really simple ecosystem. There's an input of nutrients, and then there's an output of nutrients, which is most of the time protein, and the output most of the time exceeds the input. And a normal ecosystem would be hugely complex with multiple inputs, multiple outputs, and 100 twists and turns along the way. And we've got to re-complicate our ecosystems. It's an acknowledgement of the damage that's already been caused. So we could have a whole discussion on the percentage of biodiversity that we've lost. We could have a discussion on the amount of harvests that are left in the world. We could have a amount of carbon which is released from the ground with every harvest. But for now, we'll just acknowledge that there's a hell of a lot of damage that we need to undo, and then it's challenging previously accepted knowledge. So the principal one that helps us understand what rewilding is, which I'll try and explain in a less obtuse fashion, in terms of challenging previously accepted knowledge, is, I don't know if this is also true for you guys, but when I was at school, I was taught that before humans came along, and even for a little while after we came along, the world was a closed canopy of primordial forest. And so as far as the eye can see, it was woodland. And it turns out that is fundamentally wrong. it's just not the case. So what it was a diverse and dynamic mosaic of shifting habitats, because what that picture of one primordial forest covering the globe neglects to take account of is the impacts of large herbivores. Large herbivores which were present in our landscape until really, really recently, including aurochs and elephants. There were 4 different types of elephant that roamed Europe up until as little as around 1,000 years ago. There were wild boar engaging with the landscape. There were rhinos. There were huge, big, they're called megafauna in the sort of slightly nerdy textbooks, but there were herbivores interacting with the landscape. There was a constant battle between succession and grazing or browsing, and no one animal won all the time, or no one species won all the time. So there were areas of woodland, there were areas that were overgrazed, there were areas in between, and it constantly shifted and was dynamic. There was disturbance. And so challenging that previously accepted knowledge is really, really important. And once you start to understand that one of the things that is missing is herbivores, then you start to understand how you can fix the problem. So rewilding ultimately is a proxy for that prehistory environment where there was a constant, ever-shifting tension between the grazers and the growers. And put simply, that is what rewilding is. It's not conservation in the truest sense. Conservation is to choose a thing that you like, and maybe even a time frame that you like, and try and conserve it. That is not dynamic. What you accidentally but inevitably end up doing is persecuting other things for the preservation of that which you've chosen. Rewilding tries to have no preset outcomes. I used to live and work at Net Castle, it was years ago, and right at the beginning of their rewilding journey, they're a big rewilding, probably the most famous rewilding estate in the country. If anyone hasn't heard of them, they're in West Sussex. And I was chatting to the owner, and he was telling me about it, and I said, "Oh, that's wonderful. Tell me what you're hoping to achieve," thinking that was an incredibly insightful question. And he said, "Actually, not hoping to achieve anything at all. All I'm hoping to do is to record what happens," which was an absolute, and is an absolute shift from conventional conservation. So I think that's probably a reasonable overview of what rewilding as a movement is. There are lots of different versions of it. So there are introductions of the herbivores or disturbers, or proxies of those herbivores and disturbers. So if you did have elephants, and you did have wild boar, and you did have auroch, not all of them are available in your toolkit, depending on where you are in the world. And so what you do is you put proxies in. And so most people put in pigs rather than wild boar, because wild boar you need a dangerous animals license to keep. But the principle is the same. And most people put in ponies and cattle as proxies for the tarpan and the aurochs that were there before. And I haven't yet come across anything in Europe that deals in elephants or rhinos, but you put in this suite of proxies. And the reason that it's a suite of proxies rather than one or two is, we're back to the answer being diversity, is that the way each of those animals interacts with their landscape is unique, and from it comes a cascade of different knock-on consequences and effects, and the multiplication of that cascade of different knock-on consequences and effects is what gives you your biodiversity. So a pig is monogastric and has one stomach and roots rather than grazes, although it does graze at the time in spring and autumn when the sugars are high in the grass. And because it's monogastric, certain seeds and communities of plants make their way through its gut in a certain way, some of which survive, let me get rid of that, some of which survive and are viable, some of which don't. And they rootle the ground and turn it over and create niches for the colonization, either by wind or by dormant seed bed, for seeds and different plants to grow. Cattle have got 4 stomachs. They don't bite at all. They stick their tongue out and rip and pull the grass with their tongue. So they don't actually graze that much on the ground. They're an animal of woodlands by origin. So they're pulling off the trees as well. And because they've got 4 stomachs, certain seeds are making their way through their gut, and certain seeds aren't. And the seeds that make their way through are different to those which survive having made their way through the pigs. Their coat is different to that of the pig, and so they commute seeds around the landscape differently. Their hooves are different, and so they disturb the landscape with their hooves different. And then ponies. So ponies have got buck teeth and graze at the same time, graze at the same height as rabbits. Again, they like to pull off trees as well. Their stomach is they're only monogastric, so they again have their own impact on the landscape, have different dung with different communities suiting that dung, and they've not got a cloven hoof at all, so they interact with the ground in that way. And the combination of all of those different disturbances is the bedrock or the foundation of biodiversity. I'll move on. So the Belmont Estate Rewilding project is over at Waterways Farm. It is just shy of 100 acres at the moment, although I think as of tomorrow it might be close to 150. It is small, and we remind me to talk about its smallness in a minute. And it is based on a commercially farmed, I don't want to suggest that it was too overly commercial. It was very, very typical of the farming style of the area. And so our plan over at Watercress, we've been at it for 18 months now, is to rewild and rewet an area of intensive farmland in the river valley of the Landio. We're striving to recreate those natural processes that we talked about, to connect fragmented communities, because that compartmentalization that I tried to say earlier is a problem. And to create and share that biodiverse landscape of functioning ecosystems. What it has meant is, well, I'll probably get to the next slide and tell you. So trying to take things in order, what we came across was a typical farm. It had flailed hedges, it had a mixture of arable and permanent and rotated grassland. It had the Landio going through the middle, which was very straightened and hugely incised, meaning that it had been dredged and the dredging was put on the side and the bends taken out. And until you really start looking, it just felt like a lovely normal farm. But then when you start looking and you look at it through the eyes of rewilding, you realize that it's a broken landscape, which is actually causing huge amounts of damage. So I can say this because I am a farmer, but there's a slightly horrific realization that farmers and land managers, rather than being the stewards of the countryside that we thought we were for the last 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years, it turns out that we're the baddies of this piece, or at least one of the bigger baddies. So there's massive oversimplification, but land management is one of the single biggest drivers for climate change and for biodiversity decline especially. And so whilst it's quite challenging to get your head around the part that we've played in that, the lifeline that we're thrown is that we've got the biggest levers to pull to solve this. If we do this right and we have an ambitious, open-minded approach to what we do next, we can be the heroes rather than the baddies. So it's been a bit of a journey to stop looking at those pictures and thinking everything is fine, to understanding that those pictures tell a story of no natural process and or very, very simplified ecosystem. So before I go to the next slide, which attempts to sort of paint a picture of what it might look like in the future, I'll tell you roughly what we did. 100-ish acres overfarmed and all broken up into small field compartments in which the hedges were flailed and the fields were fed with fertilizer and cropped and ploughed on a rotation. So first thing we did was take down all of the internal fences. The next thing we did was to put a ring fence around the perimeter. Horrified to say that in order to get that ring fence close to the perimeter, we've flailed the hedge back, which I hope is the last time I ever do that in my life, because it's obscene to consider the hedges to be the lifeline of your farm, and then in the autumn, at the time at which they're most valuable, berry bearing and providing resource for all those animals that need them, then we flail them back and sort of whip all the produce off the supermarket shelves just at the last minute. So we put a ring fence around and we registered it as organic, and we took all the livestock off, and then it sat there for almost a year and we did nothing to it, and it stayed reasonably stable and nothing much happened. And then we put in a very low amount. We keep organic red Devon cattle over at Belmont, and we put in a handful of those. I think in time we might move to something more, what's the word, prehistoric than the ruby red Devons. But there are a number of people, from members of the public to members of our own team, that are being taken on a journey here. So going straight to the end game is not always strategically the best way to do things. So one step at a time. We brought our own cattle over. Not enough to keep up with the grass. We deliberately want to encourage that diversity. We want some tall bits of grass, we want some tussocks, and we want some scrub. And then we very recently put some pigs in there. You need the pigs because a key principle of biodiversity is disturbance, and pigs cause a very unique type of disturbance. The reason that a robin lands on your fork when you dig your garden over is because it's evolutionary, 99.9% of its evolutionary history, it's been evolved to follow wild boar as they move through the landscape, turning the soil over, and all it thinks that we are is a boar with fork. And so often in our we apply a sort of human logic to some activities which are actually telling a pre-human story. So there's no such thing as a barn owl. For all of the barn owl's evolutionary history, there were no barns. They nested in large, lightning-struck, rotten, fallen, broken trees. There's no such thing as farmland birds at all, because for all of their history, there were no farms. And there's no such thing as a hedge. A hedge is really just scrub in a line. It's hugely valuable to us, and it's a network and a corridor. So valuable is because the rest of the farmland is so denuded of scrub. It's not a patchwork or a mosaic or a jigsaw. It's just a vast empty space. If you're a small mammal and you needed to get from one side of the field to the other, the only way you could do it is using a hedge line. So they're hugely important. I'm not downplaying their importance, but they wouldn't be important if we had a mosaic of scrub and diversity. So we put in some pigs to break up the sward of the grass that had been there for lots of time, and to create that disturbance. And I've just done the deal on some ponies, some Exmoor ponies next year, some Dartmoor ponies this year because I couldn't get my hands on any Exmoors, and they'll be joining us in 2 weeks' time. So we've got the holy trilogy of herbivores, although I'm very aware that pig is an omnivore, interacting with the landscape. In the background, we devised a plan to re-wet the landscape. So if you look at the picture on the right, you see a river that has been brutalized by human activity, probably for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the reason that river gets dredged and straightened is because the field has been drained. And so there are land drains and ditches in the field. And those land drains and ditches in the field do their job brilliantly. When it rains, within an hour, the water is commuted from the landscape into the river. And because it happens so quickly and so effectively, the water goes up by 12 foot because all the water's in the river bloody quickly. And because it goes up by 12 foot, it causes flooding. So we come along and treat the symptom of that. And so we dredge to create more capacity in the river. And gradually, year on year, the river gets more and more removed from its floodplain, which means that it can't flood upstream, which means when you get really, really high water, it floods downstream at the places that haven't been incised like this. So we relentlessly, for years and years, have been treating the symptom rather than the problem. So we've devised a radically traditional solution, which is to allow our landscape to do its job. So we're going to go through, break the land drains and fill in the ditches. And so when it rains, our fields will flood and get wet. That combined with the mosaic of scrub and trees that will start to appear because we haven't got enough grazing mouths. There's that tension between herbivores and growing material. And that will slow the water down even more so as it moves across the landscape. And the other thing it'll do, one, because of the pace at which it's moving, and two, because it's moving through this colander of scrub and tree growth and diverse different habitat types or vegetation types, is it'll get filtered along the way. So the water quality will be improved. So that's one thing. We're also instating scrapes and ponds because ephemeral water, a scrape is a bit like a pond, but it's too shallow to hold its water all year round. So it lies wet when there's water about and it dries out in the summer. And nearly all of our freshwater aquatic life is evolved to specialize in ephemeral water. And yet it's probably that and wood pasture is one of the scarcest habitats in the UK. And that's because it's unpredictable. It's neither one thing or another. It's difficult to map. It's difficult to build a house near. It's difficult to predict. And in the spirit of everything that came before rewilding, the one thing we really want is something that's predictable and reliable that we can put in our box. And so we're putting in quite a lot of scrapes and ponds. And then we're trying to turn our attention to the river. And this river can't get up and can't get out, can't flood its landscape when it needs to. But it's so deeply incised, it's perhaps difficult to see there. It's perhaps 12 foot down. Is that the plan, if I could, and will be one day, to fill it in and let the water make its way across the landscape of its own accord. And then it'll braid and bifurcate and shift and move, and you'll get gravel beds and you'll get oxbow lakes. And the river will act in a way that almost none of our rivers in this country act, because we don't allow the process to take place. If I can't manage that, then what I'll do is I'll dig a new shallow river channel across the centre of our field, spurring, I'm pointing to my picture, taking a spur off from one end and coming back in at the other. And the reason it's shallow is because I don't want to be in charge of where that river goes. So once it's been moved into the field, it'll make its own choice. So that's what's happened to date. This is what we think it and hope it might look like. The picture on the left is from Net Castle. I chose that picture because I could show you and will show you what we've got there now, but for all intents and purposes at the moment it looks like a bloody messy farm, because it's quite juvenile. But the picture on the left at Net shows you diversity. It shows you water. You've got diverse animals interacting with their landscape. You've got mature trees and you've got scrub. And the picture on the right shows the scrub really well. So that's what it's going to look like over time. That's really quite challenging for farmers and land managers and walkers to see, but it will be genuinely productive. It's important that it is productive in the ways that we described earlier, because we've got these crises facing us, from the biodiversity collapse to the climate change crisis, and one which I think sort of sneaks below the radar a bit by comparison, but is ultimately the cause of both, is that lack of connection to the natural world. And there's a tendency as humans to approach things one-dimensionally. It's easy to understand things in quite simple, tangible actions and processes. But if we do that, for example, which we are doing at the moment with something like climate change, we will miss the larger tidal wave, even than climate change, which is biodiversity decline. If we did nothing about any of these things now, biodiversity decline would kill us before climate change does. We are dangerously, perilously close to running out of pollinators. The example I tend to give in this scenario is when I look back to being driven around by my parents, or even when I first started driving, it was a bloody pain in the arse to have to keep putting the windscreen washers on to wash off the dead insects on the windscreen. If you didn't do it quickly, they set really hard and they were there for bloody ages. And if you didn't wash your car reasonably regularly, sometimes you couldn't really make out the numbers on your number plate. And now, can anyone remember the last time they killed an insect or an insect? They had to wipe an insect off their windscreen. The insects have gone. The insects are the base of the food chain. Actually, they're one step up after the soil and the mycelium, but they're very close to the base of the food chain. And once those insects have gone, we can't grow any food. And so all the rain and the rising temperatures and the instability, which is a crisis in its own right, we can't tackle them in isolation, is probably the best thing I can say. So tree planting is a really, really illustrative example. If we want to just tackle climate change, which we mustn't, then we plant trees, and you ignore the fact that planting acres and acres and acres of trees, which are the same size, the same age, often the same type, across a landscape which would have been a complex functioning ecosystem, you ignore the fact that that is actually damaging rather than positive in terms of biodiversity, and you just count the carbon. You also ignore the fact that you've had to import tunnelized tree stakes from Russia or from America or from Eastern Europe, chemically treated so that they rot. And you ignore the fact that you've had to put plastic tree tubes on them to stop the browsing deer from nibbling them. And then you just count the carbon. Then you've really replaced a crisis with a disaster, or a disaster with a crisis. So what we've got to try and do is we've got to try and tackle these issues all together in a joined up fashion. So not that rewilding is the only answer, but if you planted trees or allowed trees to grow in a rewilded setting, there's no tree tubes, there's no tunnelized stakes. The trees that grow are born out of trial and error, and so they're only the ones that have survived, so they're in the right place. An arrogant land manager like me hasn't looked at a map and sketched on what seems to me to be an elegant clutch of trees in a different place. They're born out of scrub, and the reason they're born out of scrub is because when a tree grows or a sapling grows in open ground, one of those herbivores that I love so much comes and snaffles it up. But when an acorn is deposited in an area of bramble or scrub, which only exists because we've reduced the grazing mouths so that scrub can exist and that mosaic exists, then it's too much of a pain in the, I was going to say arse, but pain in the nose to browse that little fresh shoot off. So the tree gets away. And so the thorn is the mother of the oak is the old saying. Every woodland, every copse, every withy that existed before we started planting was born out of a scrubby, messy, little scrappy bit of thorny, prickly scrub. And there's no tree tubes, there's no tunnelized tree stakes, and it's contributing to the biodiversity issue that we've got, not just the climate crisis. And it allows for a functioning ecosystem. And so whilst it's not the only solution, we've got to take a more wider, broader approach to the solutions that we try and find for these problems. And going back right to the beginning, there's a book called Harmony, which is worth a read. It's written by Prince Charles, which is a shame because not everyone, the fact that it's got his name on it will make some people pick it up and some people put it down. But putting that to one side, that is a book which explores the ramifications and the causes of our lack of connection with nature, and it's utterly fascinating, and it explores and asks the question is, would we tolerate the destruction of the Amazon? Would we tolerate some of the things that we've just discussed if we were as a race and as a species much more connected to nature? Really interestingly, given that he's the head of the Church of England, it cites that separation, the first fork in the road, as organized religion. So he talks about organized religion. Our faith and our culture was in the natural world, and so our culture was built around seasons and was built around natural processes like things staying alive and things that are really important, etc. And the point at which a god was brought into the mix, it was the point at which we stopped, something other came into the mix. Before then, it was all about our connection with landscape. It's really interesting given his role. It's quite brave. There's quite a lot of positives that you could lay at the door of Prince Charles. I'm sure there are some negatives too, but he's certainly an early adopter of this mission to reconnect people with nature. So I can't quite see those, so I'm gonna have to make them up. Hang on, everyone's faces is in front of my list. So in terms of biodiversity decline, rewilding can deliver on soil restoration. It just does, right? So you can rewild an area of land. If you're very worried about whether you should rewild it or not, because you might want to plow it up, you should rewild it anyway, because if you rewild it and then plow it up in 10 years, you will have given back all of that nature for that period of time. You will have restored the soil and it'll be productive again in a conventional farming system. So nothing needs to be forever. The good that we can do with rewilding is good, even if it doesn't last forever. It can help to halt the trajectory of species extinction, which is terrifying when you start to look at the numbers. It can restore biomass. So we talk relentlessly about biodiversity, which is important, but there's also biomass. So that's just the number or the weight or the amount of things. When we used to have 50,000 sparrows on a field, or murmurations of starlings in the sky in the tens of thousands, that biomass has gone, as well as the biodiversity. And preserving pollinators we talked about. For climate change, a project like, any rewilding project can mitigate floodwater in the way that I've described, air quality improvements, water quality improvement, and carbon sequestration. So I'm sure we'll get onto that. And then reconnection, we've talked about inspirational base for our nature-based education, exposure to those natural processes which are different to that which we're used to, connection to food and where it comes from, and then that resurgence in interest in the natural world, part brought out by COVID. This thankfully doesn't have any more words for you guys, but it's just a bit of a gallery of some of the stuff that's been going on. Got at the top left the deer and the cattle, which are interacting with the landscape naturally. Top right is one of the first things we do is we baseline in any land management. If you're going to do it properly, you need to know whether your management is having a positive or a negative impact, and the only way you can do that is to measure what's there in the first instance. And in our baseline, we discovered otters, and that which is top right, and going down into the middle. Just 2 days ago, we discovered a breeding colony of dormice, which is really heartening. And not that we discovered them other than to take a picture. There's a greater spotted woodpecker on the bottom right feeding young. And then the picture on the left is our first, we call it the Rewilders Club, which is a preschool kind of nature-based education where there's no charge because it's all paid for by the circular corporate model, where we invite parents and children into nature, where we try and reconnect them. And we do that with nature-based, play-based learning. So they get in the stream and they climb the trees and they build and climb and create things without the structure of a normal school day. So like I say, I could have talked in a million different directions, and I did forget to speak about scale, but I'm conscious that I've been speaking for quite a long time. So I'll shut up, and hopefully there'll be some questions that'll take us in a different direction. Thank you very much.
It was good speaking, Gil. Thank you very much.
No problem.
We have got a few questions. Roger started by asking about the necessity for fencing. Presumably your neighbours wouldn't be happy if some of your herbivores went on a munch, but did you want to address that?
Yeah, so there's an understandable need to perimeter fence so your animals don't wander off. But it immediately gets me to that point of scale. So what is wonderful about us is that we're just outside Bristol, and what's less wonderful about rewilding in general is that it's nearly always in the uplands, and it's nearly always on some 100,000 acre estate, and in a place that you're never going to get to visit and tread on and experience. And the reason for that is because the land is cheap up north, because you've got scale. The price per acre is much, much cheaper. And so what we're trying to do is a networked rewilding approach. So we're quite small, or very small by comparison, and I hope that by sharing it and demonstrating it to my neighbour, that he will join us, and we can have this collaborative networked approach where we've got the same management objectives. We get all the way from Clevedon in my crazy plan, from Clevedon to Bristol, by a collaborative networked approach of people who've been inspired by us taking the first step. The reality is that some people will do that, and then some people will just nod along and listen and hear that we've made it work financially and learn from our mistakes, and then they'll copy us, which is also success. We want the scale, and it doesn't matter how we get it, frankly. But what we're interested in is not having those fences. To get back round to the question, it would be ideal not to fence my herbivores out of the neighbour's farm. It would be really ideal to inspire him, and for me to spend the next year taking fences down. That is genuinely the mission: take as many fences down as possible. But there's an element of inspiration that needs to come first.
It was a really interesting section of wilding, Isabella Tree and the Knepp estate, hearing about the complaints that they had from neighbours. Do you think the passage of time, or just the fact that you are where you are, you're going to have a lot easier time converting people than they did?
So theirs is 10, 12 years old, and rewilding is a word that we've all heard now, and it's in common currency a lot more. So I suspect I'll have a slightly easier ride, but the truth is, it's not what everyone wants to see. And so we already have a job of communicating really well the benefits of what we're doing, and trying to inspire people, because it's North Somerset. Our North Somerset Council have embarked on a rewilding project over the last couple of years, and it's just backfired on them hugely in terms of public relations. People have kicked back against it big time. So it's It's by no means the easy path. It's getting easier, and the skill is about sharing what you're doing and why you're doing it. And so far, we haven't met anyone we haven't converted, touch wood, but we're very early on.
It's an interesting lesson for us with the wildflower meadow on Clifton Hill. Obviously, it's not going to look beautiful to everyone all year. Some people, when it's it's blossoming best, are probably going to think, it's looking a bit brown and unpretty.
Yeah.
So yeah, it'll be an interesting one for us to assess as well.
Yeah.
Nicola asked a question about, I guess it's about hope. Do you feel like you're in a minority in the way that you're trying to help encourage biodiversity? Do you have faith in the wider farming community making the changes that are needed?
It's a good question. Yeah, I do. And that's because, well, perhaps it's because I'm naive as a bit. That is one of my skills in life. But it's more based around the fact that the financial model has shifted. So for all of my lifetime, the European funding stream, which is now no longer in existence for us, used to fund agri-environment schemes, and they used to come through the Common Agricultural Policy, and they used to give you about 40%, if you were good, of that which they were trying to convince you to do, from hedges to set aside to field margins. And because it was only 40%, it meant that the farmers had to pay 60%, which meant that only the farmers that believed in it in the first place did it, which kept it niche, kept it on the sidelines, which is why we're in the situation we're in, because nothing powerful or fundamental has really ever happened before. And then Brexit came along, and one of the accidental results of that was that our government had to look at where that money might come from, and they came to the conclusion that it shouldn't come from them. And so now the polluter pays principle drives things, which is brilliant, and I do genuinely agree, but it's also quite a sensible sidestep from copying the financial ramifications of Brexit in terms of agriculture. But what that means is that now money is coming from private industry to pay for biodiversity and climate change mitigation. And it's like the difference between being paid by the BBC, and it's all sort of moderate and compared with everyone next door, or being paid by Sky. And so the new world is that it was going to be profitable to farm nature and to farm ecosystem services, which is the big word, which includes everything from carbon sequestration to food, to access to floodwater. And it's going to be profitable, and more profitable than their farmers ever been. The sadness is that farmers don't speak that language yet, and there will be many thousands of them that sell up before they learn the language, only to realize that they're sitting on perhaps they were sitting on perhaps the key to the solution. So I'm completely inspired that we have all of the pieces required to deliver the solution. It's about communication.
For really quite often really positive things, the Farming Today program on Radio 4, it's like 15 minutes every morning. Mm-hmm. They cover a lot of progressive things that are happening, and kind of keeping up on the elms, the government's replacement to the Common Agricultural Policy. It might be worth subscribing to.
But my feeling on elms is that if it's not careful, it'll be what we had before, redelivered, which has been uninspiring for 30 years. And so people like me, if I'm indicative, I've ignored elms and I've gone straight to the market because it's an open market now. And elms needs to make sure that it's powerful and dynamic and exciting enough to interest landowners.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't want to make it sound like I was optimistic about elms. Actually, more other independent action that various farmers are taking, and elms is not developed at all yet, is it? Really?
No, well, look, fingers crossed that we need everything we can get, but it just needs to not be too mild.
So there's a question from Sarah about access to the public to Belmont Estate, and I guess specifically the rewilding area. And then that kind of links in to Nicola's question. She asked if you've got or have plans to have any camping or glamping.
So access to the rewilding is completely critical. If I had more time and I wasn't afraid of appearing even more boring than I am, I talk about trophic cascades. There's an article about how the addition of wolves to Yellowstone changed the course of rivers, and that's by virtue of a trophic cascade. And that trophic cascade went, in a simplified version, along the lines of the wolves disturb the herbivores, which don't usually just graze willy-nilly without a care in the world. They're usually kept moving because they're terrified of being eaten by the wolves, which stopped existing. And so they moved the herbivores on just by their very existence. And then the herbivores moved on, some succession took place, some trees grew where there weren't trees. That forced the river to change its channel. And it's massively simplified, but the predators or small changes can cause lots and lots of fundamental change, and that's a trophic cascade. And I'm in the process of writing an opinion piece about how I think, whilst I've got no intention of introducing wolves, humans in the landscape might be the most powerful introduction we can make to a rewilding project. We can be the wolves. We can move the herbivores around. We must not exclude ourselves. So I just want to be in amongst it. The whole point of having one outside Bristol is that people can come and see it and smell it and touch it and enjoy it and get a little bit of wonder when you see a pig running through the scrub in front of you rather than in a fenced enclosure. And two, because we are nature. We're not separate from nature. We shouldn't be outside of it. We're not visiting it. We are nature. So access is completely important. We're crisscrossed with footpaths, but I'm looking at different ways that I can explore that through either more footpaths or through definitely through guided walks and talks and experiences. But I'm looking at some more fundamental methods than that. I want to redefine footpaths. One of the reasons I'm struggling to rewiggle my river is because there's a footpath next to it. And so they're saying, well, you can't change, the river can't shift because the footpath needs to be next to the river. And so the footpath is dictating the course of that river, which is absolutely mad. So I'm going to have a go. I'm sure I'll fail, but I'm going to have a go at redefining a footpath in this instance. I'd love it to be not put on the mapable, but next to the river, wherever the river may be. I'm sure that's a life's work in a sentence, but that would be a wonderful thing. And glamping, yes, a bit of glamping, but we're also, the reason that the farmer next door will copy, and the farmer next door to him will copy, is you end up with a stack of income streams in a rewilded model. One of them is that polluter pays principle. You can sequester carbon, you can you still produce food, you can charge more for the food, you can then add ecotourism to your stack, and it's part of our stack. So we've got some barns which we're converting, so you'll be able to stay amongst the project. We want you to stay in it, immerse yourself in it, be in it and eat it and enjoy it and connect with it. It's probably a year away. We're just designing it at the moment.
You talked about the waterways a couple of times now. Boise had asked about whether or not you'd want to redirect it, but you've done that. But more specifically, Pippa asked about potential reintroduction or introduction of beavers. Probably not enough waterway.
So look, I'm not, I can't share all of my mad ideas, otherwise you will come to the conclusion that I am absolutely mad. But yeah, beavers is one of them. So I've had a few conversations. I was at a site a couple of days ago, Friday just gone, where beavers were introduced to basically a ditch, and they've completely changed it, and it's a wonderful thing. We're not ready yet, and we're not really big enough yet, I don't think, but it's firmly in my sights.
Tom asked how the public can help.
Really difficult. So I know that I'm not answering these questions very concisely, so I apologize. But this reminds me of when we first started, and we got this piece of land, and we saw people swimming in the river, and first instinct was to say, "Oh, can you get out, please?" Wildlife, and also it's not your river, and then there was a moment I saw someone climbing a tree which I really loved, big old oak tree, and I went over, and I'm always polite, I'm not shouting at anyone, but and I was about to say, you're miles off the footpath, and that's not and you need to be careful of the wildlife, etc. But then it was a teenager, and he'd been out taking photos of wildlife, and he was climbing the tree just because. And the truth is that that is connecting with nature. People swimming in the river, people climbing trees, it genuinely is connecting with nature. And so we're on a journey where we're trying to understand the most powerful thing we can do with our land and how to do it, and so getting people involved. This is a long-winded answer, I apologize, but so at one point we were thinking of putting signs up saying please don't do this and please don't do that, which would have just been rubbish. Instead, I think what we're going to do is we put signs up saying here's what we saw here yesterday, here's where the kingfisher nest is, here's where the otters pass through. And so what I hope is we'll make a load of ambassadors and stewards out of the people that visit our land. And so rather than tell them what not to do, they'll be impassioned by what's going on, and they'll self-manage themselves through belief way more than we could ever do through a load of shitty signs that tell them what to do and where to go. Which didn't really answer your question, but it touches on it a bit. And I get asked quite a lot, how can people help? I think in the first instance, surveying is really important because I'm trying really hard not to overly manage the landscape. I don't have a handful of tasks that I can say, get a group of people together, but I'm working on it. So I'll be looking at litter picking, I'll be looking at reptile surveying and small mammal surveying. I'll be looking at maybe some willow planting, but I'm trying really hard where possible not to over interact with the landscape. So it's not as easy as you might think to create a sort of work party, but I really am grateful for the input, and I'll come up with a way that we can get people involved.
Okay. Charlotte's been saying on the chatting with Nicola about the volunteering that she's been doing, which is great. She said she responded to a post on Facebook. I got the initial impression that Charlotte might have the right background and expertise. I don't know if Charlotte, do you want to tell us? Do you, or would is what Charlotte's doing available to everyone?
Hello, yes, I did. Yeah, I'm an ecologist, so I was interested in volunteering to see how this project starts off and watch how it may evolve. So I do have skills, and there were other people there from all different backgrounds, or people just starting ecology careers. But I think as it goes on, like Gil said, probably surveys always need multiple pairs of hands. And so I'm sure there's always things that people can help in, whether they're an expert or not, or if they're just interested. So it was through Ethos, was the ecology consultancy, wasn't it, who seemed to be organising that. But yeah, I think probably there's always scope to get involved in these things if skills, putting a programme together or something.
I am, and it's because there's two reasons for doing that. Is one, because I might want the output, but probably more powerful than that is I really want to connect people with it. I want to create a load of supporters and believers, and so they're both very powerful. So there will definitely be a program. I just need to get my thinking cap on.
Cool.
Yeah, I did see the dormouse last week, and the person that came with me is just a student, so he's sort of training up. So that was nice. Yeah.
No, it's really exciting. Yeah, really exciting.
Yeah, it was good.
I don't have a dormouse handling license, but I've been walking along that hedgerow, looking at the nesting material, thinking, oh, I wonder when they're going to come back. So I was chuffed to hear that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's all right.
Thanks, Charlotte. Mike has written to point out that people from minority ethnic backgrounds tend to have less access to nature, and has planted the idea whether or not something circular and restorative is or could be done to potentially engage with those communities.
So my work to date has been about creating the landscape, but the latest bit of activity over at Belmont is we've recruited an education lead, and they are now reaching out into Bristol and into all of Bristol to try and encourage that access from schools, all schools, with no charge. In fact, it's more than there being no charge, it's that we're trying to remove all of those financial barriers. So at the point at which a school says we would love to come, but we don't have the resource to even pay for the transport, for example, then we would say, don't worry, because we've got our corporate business model, and the whole purpose of that is that we stump up the money and we get you there. So we are not yet targeting any specific ethnic groups. We are deliberately without target, but so we're just trying to make sure that it's available for absolutely everyone, whether they've got the money or not. So everyone from Clifton College who are on the list to some of the schools which have just got no resource at all. It will be a much better man than me, or person than me, that deals with this one. I'm really just the farm manager, but the mission is to have no targets whatsoever.
Thanks, Gil. I don't think I've missed any of the questions. Please, if I have missed anyone's question, you could pop it in again. I've tried to keep up. I was going to ask about record keeping, but we've touched on that a little bit with your volunteers, and also a little bit about the funding. Thinking about Nep Estate, I wondered how, if you'd received EU funding, which is going to get phased out, and if that's why you've got the model that you have now, or if you were never reliant on that.
Never reliant on that. Bit more. So if I had to sum up my career experience, it's been about conservation, extensive food production and estate management, and commerciality. And in Belmont, they all mix together. And we're proudly commercial because it's the commerciality which will ultimately cause people to copy us. And so the EU funding stream was never really for us. NEP. So what you can sell now is the journey from A to B, from degraded landscape to restored, or that's really a naff thing to say, not restored, but to less degraded, and the journey you can sell. The problem with wildlife trusts and national trusts and NEPs is that they are a bloody long way along their journey, and so by virtue of being pioneers, that they find the financial bit a little bit more difficult. But in the last year alone, the Wildlife Trust have spent £25 million on new purchases, and that's because they're trying to maneuver themselves in the market, because they're very good at what they do. They just haven't got any places that are at point A in the journey. They're all at point B. And NEP are doing something broadly similar. But for people doing the right, this should always be how you do things. The tail shouldn't wag the dog. You should do things because they fit your values and your mission. But providing that you can stick to those values and mission, there is money to be got, and quite a lot of it.
Thank you. We'll wrap it up shortly. Got another quick question from Nicola, and just to acknowledge Roger, you're totally right, Roger, and I will send another to my Tory MP for all the good it will do. But Nicola's asked why Exmoors and not Dartmoors.
So can I answer that question in reverse? We are getting Dartmoors in a couple of weeks because they're accessible to us on a loan. So an important part of this process is to acknowledge that I don't really know how to do it. None of us really know how to do it. I know how to farm, but I'm trying to do the opposite to that. So how many ponies is the right amount of ponies in our landscape is a question I don't know the answer to. So I've gone for Dartmoors because I know someone that can lend me some for 6 months, and we can just watch what happens. They happen to be the Dartmoor ponies that Conservation graze the RSPB headquarters, and they don't want them for the winter. So I'm going to take them and just watch and see what happens. And I don't know someone who can get me Exmoors, that's the answer to why I've got Dartmoors first. The answer to why I want Exmoors ultimately is because Exmoors are utterly ancient. They're probably the closest thing to a tarpan we've got in the world. They are pre-agriculture. They are rarer than giant pandas, and they're local. Genuinely rarer than giant pandas, and they're very local. And so they do that job of a proxy for a prehistoric herbivore. In fact, they don't do it as a proxy. They are one, and so they're a natural choice.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're getting close to 9 o'clock now. We normally try to ensure we're done by 9, so I think we'll probably say thank you very much and good night, unless anyone's got I'm interested in planting willows. Where do I sign up?
I don't have a willow planting signing up form yet, but I'll make one. a winter full of willow planting would be brilliant. And thank you for
Okay,
the offer.
cool.
I
This has
think I'd
been-
just like to say, before we do go, I'd like to thank Gail and say that I've surprised by, I don't know why, but I'm surprised by how radical what he's doing is saying. And it's really shaken up a lot of my preconceptions. So I think that's something I appreciate very much. Thank you.
Thank you. It's the opposite to radical, feels radical, but we're radically going back to things which already existed.
Whatever.
I haven't invented anything, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Lots of thank you streaming in. Brilliant. Thanks, Gil.
No worries. Thank you for your attention and enthusiasm, guys.
All right, cool. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
I thought we might stick around for a short time, but I think Grant's already gone.
Yeah, he's like, I'm off. I've had enough.
But that's fine, that's fine. But thank you for pointing out the lack of recording. I think actually I came in just before he really started talking about rewilding.
No, I think it was fine. Yeah, he hadn't really got started that much, so don't worry. I just well, let's stop. Should we stop recording now?
Oh yes. I've got to get used to this.